Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to the IES Summit on Reading. And in particular, thank you for coming to my session, Enhancing Reading Outcomes for Students in Middle and High School with Reading Difficulties. I know we don't usually think about high school and middle school when we think about reading, but actually literacy outcomes across the grade span is an important topic. My name is Sharon Vaughn. I'm the Manuel Justiz Endowed Chair in Education at the University of Texas, and I'm also the Executive Director of the Meadows Center for Preventing Educational Risk. The work that I'm presenting today has been funded by the Institute for Education Sciences, and of course, the kind of work I do requires heavy lifting, of which I do not do by any means alone. My colleagues on the work that I'm presenting today include Greg Roberts, Elizabeth Swanson, and Jeannie Wanzek, as well as other key researchers that are listed on this slide. The funding for the projects and the set of studies that I'll be talking about is listed below, and I want to thank the U.S. Department of Education for their support, although in no way are they responsible for the findings or anything else I say today. The first thing I want to talk about is a set of studies that we entitle PACT. And what we mean is promoting adolescent comprehension of text. And this set of studies was focused on designing instructional goals in secondary classrooms, particularly in the areas of content area knowledge. And our goals were twofold. One, so that we could help teachers enhance the content knowledge, the acquisition of knowledge in the content area, but also improve their understanding and comprehension of text, and in specifics, the information text. And we wanted to accomplish this through text-based routines. In other words, activities that engage students in the use of text as a source of data as they worked in, as in this example, social studies, but also in science. So let me take you back a little bit to share with you how it is that we put these instructional practices together to form PACT. Through the Reading for Understanding funding through the Institute for Education Sciences, we organized a large team of scholars across the United States to help us think about the constructs, unpack the malleable factors that would be associated with reading comprehension. And we organized them in this way. We thought about intervention design experiments. We thought about cognitive processing studies, motivation and engagement, and then reading engagement studies. And we conducted these studies in separate subgroups and teams. And I represent each of these types of studies through this ball of yarn. And the reason I do is because the way we thought about it is that the findings from these studies would be woven together to create like a rope or a belt or a unified construct around reading comprehension. And that yielded this organizational structure that we call PACT, or Promoting Adolescent Comprehension of Text, components. These components can be thought of as Comprehension Canopy. And when I say Comprehension Canopy, you can sort of imagine a canopy in a forest. And this is the overarching structure for the content learning we're teaching, the sort of big ideas, the guiding principles, or if you will, the most important questions we're going to be answering. And underneath this comprehension canopy, which we wanted to be visible to students from the beginning, so they sort of knew the purpose for what they were reading and learning. We also wanted students to be able to know essential vocabulary, and this essential vocabulary would be the key words. Sometimes they would be considered academic vocabulary, but sometimes they would just be considered these key ideas. And we also wanted the component to include text-based discourse. So in other words, when students gave their points of view, were asked questions, were displaying their knowledge, they would be using text as a resource to support those claims. Over time, we designed team-based learning comprehension checks. Now, team-based learning shares many of the important components of cooperative learning. It has, for example, an individual accountability. It also has, for example, a shared group component. This individual accountability is checked individually, and then you come together with the team to be held accountable for your knowledge. This team-based learning also has as a component a knowledge application. So just to kind of give you some examples of those components so they come to life, Comprehension Canopy routine, for example, in one sample lesson that I'm sharing with you, takes about 7 to 10 minutes. And in this, you use materials and resources to serve as a springboard to help students imagine the key ideas they're going to be studying, usually for about 10 lessons or about 2 weeks. So it might involve pictures, as I show here, but the springboard could also involve a 2 to 3 minute video just to kind of give students the background knowledge. And the focus here is to develop knowledge that they can link to their prior knowledge, but also enhance and extend their knowledge. And the idea is to introduce these springboard images to provide a purpose for the learning and also to get students ready through a comprehension question. So, for example, how do interactions between living and non-living things affect an ecosystem? That would be considered the overarching question for this comprehension canopy. I mentioned to you that there's also another component that we call our essential vocabulary. And we, of course, know that you can't teach students word by word everything you want them to know. But you can come up with the essential words that really serve as sort of the fundamental words for which we attach a lot of related words. In many ways, I think of these essential words as like Velcro, where we're hoping that extending words can kind of stick on. So when you say a key word like interact, you want students to understand it in a scientific way about how various systems or parts of an ecosystem interact. But you also want it to be related to related words like interaction, influence, relate, connect. And we want students to understand this through the examples in the text, but also through turn and talking so that it becomes part of their discourse. And as you look at these examples, you can see that we try to make the ideas of essential vocabulary visually attractive. I mentioned to you also that an important element of PACT is what we think of as text-based classroom discourse. And this text-based classroom discourse evolves, of course, around small units of text that students read. And then in small groups, usually they're teens, they respond to critical questions about that text. So in this example, what changes have humans made in the Amazon region over the past 50 years? And these examples can be found in the text, but many students will also have examples from their own background knowledge. And we have found that depending upon the age of the student or the grade and their development in reading, you can start with smaller chunks of text, as I illustrate here, but you can move over time as students become more proficient to larger and larger sets of text. So the other component of PACT is comprehension check. And as I mentioned earlier, the cool thing about the comprehension check is that it has as part of it an individual accountability and a group accountability. So students all receive a comprehension check, a set of questions or activities. They respond to each of these individually. And then they come together with their group or their team and they share the answers. What's really cool about this is that in the group, they get what we call a scratch off, which you can see at the bottom of this slide. And in the group, they decide what the answer is because not everyone in the group will have exactly the same answer to each question. And then if the answer is correct, they get a star. And if it's not, they don't. But it's also a good way for the teacher to be able to tell how many scratch-offs, if you will, how many times they got the answer wrong, so that she can then determine which of these elements of what she's teaching would benefit from reteaching. We also know that if students are going to really learn things deeply and be able to hold on to them over time to sustain learning, there have to be opportunities for knowledge application. But we want this knowledge application to be kind of fun and meaningful. And so an example of that comes from this social study unit that we designed around the competition of causes of the American War. And as you can see, there's different teams that take on different issues related to the causes of the American War, with the idea being that they come together and see if they can come up with common causes. So we've explained, or I have explained, a little bit about the components of PACT. But what I'd like to do now is transition to share with you some of the findings from the studies we've done. The first two studies I want to share are the first two studies that we've done with PACT. The citations for these studies are all available at the end of this PowerPoint. The first study was conducted in 2013. We had 5 teachers, which doesn't sound like a lot, but what we did was we randomized at the class level. So when you look at the first orange box for each study, what you'll see is we had 27 classes in the first study, which we considered a pilot. And then based on those results, we did more of an efficacy trial where we had 85 classes. And you can see we had 400 students in one study and about 1,500 students in the second study. In these studies, the randomization level was at the class level, and so classes were randomly assigned to receive PACT or business as usual. We consider this a particularly rigorous design because in all cases, both the PACT cases and the BAU cases, that is the treatment and the comparison cases, the content was the same. So all students learned the same thing and they had the same teachers. We blocked on teacher so that we could really understand, probably in the most challenging way, the effects of PACT. And what you can see is if you look at the studies from 2013 and 2014, those were the first two studies, and I'll share the results in a minute. Then we conducted a study in 2017. And then if you look at the Wanzek et al. Study, that study focused primarily on students with disabilities, and so did the 2017 Swanson study, and that study was randomized at the student level. And then the other two studies, the 2014 study and 2015 study, and you'll see in parentheses it says TBL only, and that's because we wanted to look at the relative effects of team-based learning. And so in those two studies, we did not provide PACT. We only provided team-based learning to the participating students. So in this slide, what you'll see is those repeat of those same studies, those same efficacy trials. But in this case, in the columns, you'll see the effect sizes, and these are Hedges G effect sizes for content knowledge, content reading comprehension, and broad reading comprehension, which is a distal measure using the Gates reading comprehension measure. So if you look at the two, we think the measures we would hypothesize change on, that would be content knowledge and content reading comprehension. All of the orange boxes suggest statistically significant differences in favor of our treatment condition. And in all cases, effect sizes were in favor of the treatment condition. And so now to focus specifically on struggling readers, our students with reading disabilities, what you'll see in the 5 studies that follow, these efficacy trials also show statistically significant differences in those orange boxes for students with reading difficulties or disabilities. And you'll see that these effect sizes are at least as large as for students who are in the general typical readers, if you will, and that in some cases the findings are greater. So when it comes to content knowledge and content reading comprehension on 2 of our studies, the findings are larger than for typical readers. So what are some of the highlights? What we think is that with the PACT instruction practices delivered, you can expect that the approach would take approximately 2 to 3 weeks for each unit. There are 3 units, and each lesson takes about 45 minutes a day, or if you're using the sort of what's common in some schools, the A-B class schedule, it would be 90 minutes every other day. So we also looked at students' performance over time. So after the treatment condition or the study was terminated, we did follow-up assessments for participating students in both the treatment PACT and the BAU typical condition. And we have statistically significant differences in favor of the PACT condition for the retention of content area learning. So when students are placed in classrooms with a range of achievement levels, and by a range of achievement levels, I mean some students are better readers, some students are poorer readers, teachers often have higher expectations, which affects instruction, and potentially academic engagement and motivation can be increased. So we were interested in looking at the extent to which the PACT intervention affects heterogeneity. And so we were interested in how students with reading difficulties perform on reading outcomes, and to what extent the proportion of students with reading difficulties in a class would moderate student outcomes. So if you look at this particular bar graph, what you'll see is from 10%, which is the first bar, to 100%, which is the last bar. These are the percentage of students by class in which struggling readers were present. So we had many classes, 14, in which there were 10%. We had some classes where 20%, 30%. So this is the percentage of struggling readers in the class. And what you'll see is that the gray line, or the weaker dark line, is the control students. And if you look at the dark line, what we would call the darker line, the one that is more angled or is tapered, what you'll see is the treatment. In both cases, these lines represent struggling readers. And what you'll see is that the percentage of students in the class who are struggling readers moderates the outcome on content knowledge. So to explain further, for each 10% increase in the proportion of struggling readers, the content knowledge post-test scores decreased by 0.65 points. This is also true not just for content knowledge, but also for content reading comprehension. So again, the lighter line is the control students. The darker line is the treatment students. And what you will see for reading comprehension in the content area is that for each 10% increase in proportion of struggling readers, the content reading comprehension post-test scores decreased by 0.78. So overall, as we look at this set of studies, looking at promoting and accelerating comprehension for adolescents through text, we find that it's effective in classrooms with content area instruction, and that there are a number of studies that confirm this. We know that PACT has demonstrated efficacy among struggling readers included in content area classes, and we have pilot data that suggests that it's effective with students with disabilities, although that pilot data is quasi-experimental, and so we're in the process, thanks to NICSR, of studying this same approach, that is PACT, with students with disabilities. We also know that PACT is a text-based, discourse-based intervention that requires facility with language use. And because of this, we think we detected an interaction between the proportion of struggling readers in a class and student outcomes, so that when students are placed in teams, in our team-based learning, it is advantageous for those teams to not be overloaded with students that have reading challenges. So I'm now going to shift a little bit and talk about another multi-component reading intervention. And this reading intervention is referred to as Reading Intervention for Adolescents, or RIA. And this multi-component one focuses on advanced word study, fluency, vocabulary, and collaborative strategic reading, which is a cooperative learning approach to text-based reading that my colleague Jeanette Klingner and I designed for 4th and 5th grade students, text-based discussions, and writing. So for the word study, we used Archer, Gleason, and Vauchon's rewards. We did an advanced word study instruction in which students learned several things about the morphology of the language, including prefixes and suffixes. But they also learned many things about complex vowels, for example, R-controlled vowels like ER, IR, UR, and AR. This advanced word study was taught within the context of a fluency approach, so that students had an opportunity to learn the components of a multisyllable word, but they learned them not just in isolation, but also in context. And this advanced word study also provided an opportunity for them to learn and apply the meaning of the morphological aspects, such as prefixes and suffixes, but also the meaning of words. As I mentioned to you, we did all of this within a collaborative strategic reading approach. And this collaborative strategic reading approach included previewing, that is, a set of practices that we did before students read, click and clunk and get the gist, a set of practices students did while they were reading, and wrap up, which is a set of practices students did after they read. So for example, with CSR with content area text, we always use a learning log. We have text, for example, this 9th grade biology text, and students have an activity they do before they read, which is brainstorm and setting a purpose. They do click and clunk and gist during reading, and then they summarize after reading. And they work in a collaborative group to do this, and they record within their learning log. Sometimes students each take a role in this collaborative group, and in that role, they may complete one or more element of their learning log. And so, as I expressed earlier with PACT, the explicit or vocabulary routine is that students say the word and pronounce it so they know what the word is. They have a student-friendly definition. They turn to a partner and they use the word in an appropriate way with each other. They discuss what they know about the word, and we always use examples and non-examples. So as an example, here is convert and how we would teach that. Here's a graphic organizer showing how we use 3 words, function, convert, and transport, using definitions, examples, and non-examples. So in a large-scale randomized controlled trial of RIA, we have 2 studies. These are 2 separate non-overlapping RCTs. And both of these studies were done with students with reading difficulties. In the first study, students were primarily monolingual English students. In the second study, students were primarily English learners. In both studies, the RIA was provided for 2 years. So it was for students in 9th grade, and then we yoked students and continued it in 10th grade. It was done for about 10 to 15 students in a group, so pretty much the size of a small class, 50 minutes a day for the entire academic year, which was approximately 160 lessons. The effect size was like a class, a typical class like an elective. The main effect in study 1 was that for all participants, the effect size was 0.43 on the Gates reading comprehension test. And for students with disabilities, which we disaggregated from the group as a whole, the effect size was 0.44. For study 2, where we focused on students who were English learners, they were either currently identified as Ls or dismissed within the last 2 years. You will see that we have a 0.41 effect size, but the effect size on a reading comprehension measure called the TOSREC is 0.18, but the other measures were non-statistically significant. So our results for English learners were not as robust as our results for monolingual students. Okay, so RIA led to improved reading comprehension for monolingual students with reading difficulties, and reading comprehension is much more difficult to improve passage comprehension for current and former Ls, English learners. likely due to challenges with vocabulary and background knowledge and experience with reading, and various student and school level factors, such as the fact that the study was conducted in a densely urban school that was very under-resourced. So, how would I put this set of studies together for adolescents with reading difficulties? One of the things we think we've learned is that improving reading comprehension will require interventions that will always be necessary. But even though they're necessary, they're unlikely to be adequate without a coordinated school-wide approach to enhance what occurs during school. Without this enhanced word reading, vocabulary, language development, and background knowledge, adolescents' reading comprehension will remain underdeveloped. We think these school-wide approaches emphasize vocabulary and academic knowledge in all classes, not just in an isolated intervention class. We think these school-wide approaches create opportunities for structured and purposeful peer interactions, organized team-based learning approaches. We think that increased opportunities to use content area text for word reading practice and content knowledge building is essential. And we think these school-wide approaches incorporate reading strategies like comprehension monitoring and main idea generation, but recognize that strategies alone are not going to improve reading comprehension. As a resource for you, we provide these 10 key policies and practices for reading intervention. And if you go onto our website, you'll see that these 10 key documents, which are available and downloadable free, will summarize not just what these practices are, but how you can do them in your classroom and in your school. We think that reading interventions for adolescents explicitly teach foundation skills for adolescents who require word level support. That is word reading and word meaning. And we recognize that adolescents with the most significant reading difficulties, including students with reading disabilities, will likely require interventions over multiple years. If you want more information about these studies, or you want to see some activities and lessons that correspond with what we talked about, we invite you to visit the website, which is listed on this last slide. If you want to actually read the studies in full, these references describe the studies and their findings, and also provide access to the effect sizes and analyses that were referred to in this presentation. Thank you for joining, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me.